I'm excited about today's episode because this is something that really comes up every day in talking to people is what's a fair rate to charge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we dug into this some more and started thinking about it is I remember the time in my construction business where someone was telling me what was fair and they were a customer. And we've talked about kind of the general topic on the podcast before, but it was like, this is a fair hourly wage. He had a big house that he was building and he said, well, I can find guys who work for my project for $20-something an hour. And I remember just thinking about that as just being like, well, that is not what is indicative of value of what the hourly wage is at all.
Yeah.
And so today we're talking about value. And it's not like Walmart, great value necessarily, but there is an aspect of that, of like what you should charge and what that should look like. And I think this is really essential. If you've been in business for a long time, it might be a good time to revisit that because its value changes constantly. And then if you're new to business, you're getting started, there's like, well, what should I be charging?
Yeah.
So we're going to get into that.
I think there can be a tendency too, just in our conversations before, a tendency of, like, what is the competition charging? I need to be cheaper than the competition.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're going to dig into this more, but it's a huge risk for contractors, businesses to think that way of like, well, I have to be cheaper than the competition or I have to, there's aspects of that are important to understand where the market's at, but, and we can dive into that more, but it's just that risk point of charging less than the competition. Let's not have that be our mentality going into value.
So there's definitely like this ethics aspect of how you charge, right? It's like, what's a fair thing to charge? And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to there. In one aspect of like, well, what's the going rate?
Yeah.
There's also an aspect of like running a legit business. Like you have to have a viable business that pays its bills. And then, and I think the connecting piece for us is the value statement, the value proposition that you bring to your client. And I think as we unpack this a little bit is, you can be losing money and overcharging your client, which is not what we could, it's not what you would think. And what I mean by that is, you could have a scenario where you're charging your customer a lot of money, but because of the lack of value, poor process, inefficiencies, that could just be a lot of dollars just being burnt that aren't creating value.
Sure.
And so I think that's a huge aspect of this as well. And then you could be losing money and because you're not charging enough, but it's very common.
Yeah.
Where it's just you're losing money because you're just pricing yourself too cheaply. Right. We'll talk about that. And then the other aspect of this would be you could be making money and still be undercharging. And this is kind of what you're talking about, that aspect of what's everyone else charging, and I'll undercut that and maybe significantly undercut it. We'll talk about what value is here in a little bit, but maybe a few stories as well I think could kind of help with this. I know several people that have experienced this, and I think it's not a stagnant thing, value, but it's like where you have this business is bloated, it's inefficient, the overhead's high, there's a lot of mistakes, the team is disjointed, there's so many things going on that just make it where you're charging top dollar but barely making it.
Yeah, you're winning high dollar contracts, things like that, but your bottom line is not reflective of that.
Yep. Yeah. And this could be any type of business, but contracting, tradesmen, but even a restaurant could be that way, where they're charging $100 a plate and barely making it because their expenses are so high. I have another situation, speaking of that second point where you're losing money because you're not charging enough, and I've had multiple clients, and now you guys can identify with this too, is just, well, a fair thing is $30 an hour or $40 an hour of just putting a number to it.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you're not making money. Your customer is essentially ripping you off.
Right.
Maybe not intentionally.
Right.
Maybe that's not their intention. But and then how many people do we know that are charging, a flat rate and have been for years, and they have lost the fact that their value proposition is changing.
Yeah.
And they're highly experienced, they're efficient, they're getting stuff done, they got their tools, their truck, their insurance. They're way better today than they were yesterday. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, they're improving, like constantly improving on the trajectory of growth, right? They have better skills. They have better fulfillment, essentially. And they're still charging what they were like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, things like that. So really leaving quite a bit of money on the table. And it's not just all about money. It's value, right? Like you should be earning more the more you invest in your business and grow. So a lot of people that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that. What is fair in that situation? You are worth more today than you were yesterday because you put the hard work into it. And the other thing about it, guys, is you could be worth less money today than you were yesterday because you did the opposite. Yeah. If you're just, not applying yourself and not leveling up, not running an efficient business, and you're going to be worth less. The value goes down.
I remember some of those early conversations about it. It's pretty specific, but about charging material markup. Right. Like we were talking to some guys who had kind of been on this trajectory of like, I make X amount an hour and they've never increased their rate, or maybe not never, but just in a long time, they were due for an increase of rate and they weren't marking up materials at all, but they were still acquiring the materials for every project. And I remember that moment where we were like, you have to like add a markup. You're acquiring the materials. You have the knowledge for what materials you actually need. You're not sending your customer to the store 15 times to find a screw, or whatever. I remember our projects at home, it's always like we go to Home Depot or Lowe's. If we're doing a DIY project ourselves, my husband and I, we go like 15 times for the same stupid part because we can't find this right fitting or whatever.
Half the time spent at the store.
Right. Yeah. But that just speaks to it of like the homeowner doesn't have the knowledge of what you need. So I just remember some of those conversations early on of like, hey, it doesn't have to be it's not unfair to charge a markup on the materials that you're acquiring for the project. And so anyway, just kind of to dig into that story.
It's great.
It's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that markup piece and that's back to that value statement. You're providing value in this scenario where you're saying, well, I'm eliminating extra trips. I'm saving you material, the knowledge of what material to get, how much of it to get. Yeah, so that's a value statement. So it's worth the markup. So it's a really good call out. Exactly. I think there is an essential aspect of running a business we were talking about as we're prepping for the show is like there's this, like how do you balance all this out? You are in business to make money, or at least you should be. Now you're not there to gouge people. You're not there to retire off of people or off of any person. Any one person.
One person. Like you are.
You're there to retire off of many
eventually.
People. Not off of one person. My grandfather would be like, I want to pay for what's fair, but I don't want anybody retiring off of me.
Yeah, there you go.
But I think we've seen many examples. I mean, you guys can look at examples around you of people that have very, very poor business processes. Maybe they're really inept at running a business for a variety of reasons. And you think about, through poor decisions, bad planning, inefficiency, mistakes. It's like, well, they could charge. It's not about how much they charge their customer. Right. It's like about correcting all of those things. And maybe they shouldn't even be running a business because they need to level up. Yeah. They need to create that value proposition first.
Yeah, the person who's not fulfilling on, those levels of poor quality, poor business practices, things like that. Like the customer really is getting a bad deal in the project in itself. So,
So the business side of it might be the formula side of being like, well, we're going to charge X number of dollars to cover our labor, what we're paying our guy, plus our cost of insurance and taxes and workman's comp and all the rest of our labor burden, and then plus our markup to cover our overhead. And that could be, crazy dollars and still lose money.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Well, and if you haven't actually factored those rates, then you likely are losing money.
Yes, well, there's that too.
That's another episode, though, in itself.
I think we have addressed that on other episodes in the past, and I think there's this aspect of putting in the hard work that we've talked about, and then feeling like there's an aspect of like, the doctors go to school for years and years and years, and nobody's paying them a dime while they're paying out the wazoo for education. And then you go in for an appointment and they charge you $150 for 5 minutes, and you think, oh, my God, what a ripoff. Meanwhile, the guy's like drowning in millions of dollars of debt from his student loans and everything like that. It's like, well, maybe it's not obviously it's not the same thing exactly, but nonetheless, there is an aspect of you guys putting in the blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah. And is it fair to get rewarded for that later on?
For sure. So, we think absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So what is value? Break it down for us. What from your perspective, what defined value? Yeah.
Well, can't say it enough, but it's not stagnant as well. Like the value is something that can go up and down and sideways. It's like
positive, negative. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a roller coaster.
Yeah. I think number one value is character. It's honesty. It's integrity. I like to define integrity as doing the right thing when nobody's looking. It's the aspects of a project where, we had a job where somebody had done waterproofing in a crawl space. And the homeowner they're elderly people, and nobody's going down in that crawl space to look at it later.
Yeah, right.
And so therefore, they cheated. They didn't do a good job. And one of our guys went down there and looked at it. I was like, this job isn't done right.
It's terrible.
It's not even sealed. And that is not integrity.
Yeah.
That is doing the wrong thing because you can get away with it.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I think an aspect of value is integrity, a huge aspect of it.
Yeah.
The character that you have is doing what's right.
Yeah.
And there's another aspect of this as well. And this, unfortunately, I wish it wasn't a part of it, but character will cost you.
Yeah.
Not in the long run, but in the short time, there are times when doing the right thing has cost me.
Sure.
And I think that's part of it. And I think in the long run, it's definitely net positive.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, in those moments of owning up to a mistake and saying, I messed up and that's going to cost me.
Yeah. I would say the opposite is true with a lack of character, right? Like you're going to clean up in the short term, but then business is going to dry up in the long term.
Good point.
And you're not going to get any referrals.
Wow.
Your business is going to dry, so it is like a short-term, long-term endurance kind of game,
Yes.
character
Yes.
is. So
That's good. Yep.
Yeah.
The customer journey is another aspect of value as well. Like, can we provide this experience that's amazing, or is it just lackluster? And so that's a value proposition. Does the customer feel like they're taken care of? I mean, what does it look like for you? What is the customer journey?
Yeah, I think all the things we're mentioning are super important, but I think with the customer journey side of things, providing an excellent experience for your customer from start to finish, right? If you're selling a job in the pre-construction phase, you have excellent communication, right? You're communicating beforehand, during, and after, just to make sure that everybody's in the loop. And I'm not saying like being overly available, like outside of what's reasonable, but setting the expectations up front for, hey, you can expect the project to go like this, right? Educating your customer on the process and really just teeing it up, being responsive with communication. I know a lot of guys who I think it's a business rule, and maybe it's different. There's going to be reasons to not have this, but business rule should be you're going to get back to your customer within 1 business day, like some kind of response. It doesn't mean you have to have the answer for it, but being like, hey, I got this. I'm going to dig into it and I'll get back to you, right? I mean, that's so simple to send a quick text like that or quick email like that. And so I think little things like that can either produce a great experience for customers or a poor experience for customers. And so spending a little bit of extra effort, a little bit of extra time to set those expectations. We have podcasts and we talk a lot about negative expectations too, right? With timelines and things like that. Don't promise things you can't keep.
Yes.
Just all of those core, if you put yourself in the customer's shoes of like, hey, what would I want to hear in this part of the project or in the pre-construction phase or whatever phase of the project you're in, how can you make that customer journey smooth and positive, whether they hire you again or they refer you to somebody else? Like that's really what you're going after with a positive customer journey. So,
and it's a huge value statement.
It is.
Yeah. And as you get better at it over time, hopefully you get better.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the up and down aspect of it, but a consistent experience with the customer being like, wow, that's a 5-star business sort of from day one to the final project.
Yeah. I would also say it's like super low hanging fruit for you guys who are listening to the podcast, because I do think that whether right or wrong, and contractors get packaged into a package and a type of person, right? And a lot of that is poor experiences that they've had with somebody else. But I know a lot of contractors who have not had great communication. And I just think there's a huge opportunity if you can be a contractor in a business that has excellent communication. I think you'll blow competition out the water.
Yeah. I would add to that a soft, and what I mean by that is not wishy-washy. You want to be direct.
Yeah.
But then also like a caring, sympathetic of like, I want to understand another person's perspective goes a very long way. A lot of people I know in the trades are, they're manly men, like some of these guys, I can hang plaster 16-foot sheets by myself, it's a tough guy kind of thing. And some of that translates in the communication. I think there's an aspect of just being, I want to understand somebody else's perspective. And when somebody doesn't know, there's this thing that I've heard a lot lately, people are such sheep, they just go along. And I'm like, yes, they are. And that's aspect of human nature. We are sheep sometimes. We follow along, we follow other people. Yeah. Sometimes we're wrong, sometimes they're right.
Yeah.
But I think that's just an aspect of human nature of like, we just, we like to fit in. We're kind of part of a pack, It's like, we don't allow it, obviously we could be lied to, we could be manipulated, but there's an aspect of people I bring that up because you don't want to look at the customer negatively because they don't understand.
Right.
You are there to come alongside and say, well, actually, from my experience, that's not the way it's worked out before, but I want to understand their perspective as well. Anyway, so
I think great communicators, we could spend all day on communication. We have podcasts on communication, but also great communicators, they address things up front. You know, you talked about the direct nature of that, of like when things go wrong, what do you do? Like, are you communicating or are you like hiding from the conflict?
Wow.
Right? So like excellent communicators don't avoid conflict, I guess would be a final thought
well said
on that.
Well said. Yeah.
Okay, competition. Talk about competition. That's another
Yes.
value proposition aspect of that. So
well, supply and demand kind of influences your value, right? Because you're looking at the market conditions of it's not just you competing by yourself in a market. So I think your value is somewhat determined by your competition.
Yeah.
So obviously we talked about customer experience forever, but I think that's all needs to be said about that.
That's good. And also alongside that, reputation, right? Like your demand and your brand, right? Are the reputation side of
this
things
is
that
massive.
add value.
Yeah.
You know, what do people, and I would define like brand, you know, like that's kind of a ethereal term for construction sometimes, but really your brand is just what are people saying about you and what are they saying about your business? I think you and your business.
Your reviews.
Exactly.
Referrals, et cetera. That's really good.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that probably one of the really ties in with the reputation piece is what does the final product look like? What do you deliver? And how consistently can you deliver those results? If you're known for whatever the trade you're in and you do an exceptional job, that work product is just really, really great work. Well, that's valuable.
Yeah.
There's very few people that could replicate what you do if that's the case. And then it's like, well, that's a huge value statement. And I think this is what we're talking about earlier of value not being stagnant is if you're applying yourself and mastering new skills and studying process and saying, how can I get better? So many of you guys obviously you're listening to this podcast because you want to level up for whatever little tidbits we can give you and hopefully be entertaining along the way too. But nonetheless, you're studying this, you want to get better and you're looking for information towards that end. And I think that's a huge value proposition you bring because you're better today than you were yesterday because the books you read, the podcasts you listen to, and the people you hang out with that are highly experienced people.
That's good. So good. Yeah. We'll talk about availability and timeliness and how that like really leads into your value proposition as well.
If you need something done tomorrow, that could be more valuable. I had somebody come when I was building, we need something done by Thanksgiving. And we just happened to be able to have a team to be able to pull that off. Well, they paid way more than they would have otherwise because they needed it done. What was fair in that situation. For us, we're like, well, we're squeezing them into a schedule and making sacrifices to do that, and we're going to charge more money. So that's value.
Yeah. So it's not unfair.
It's not unfair
to charge that.
Yeah. Obviously, you don't want to clean up in that situation in the sense of like gouging people. This is not price gouging in the sense of a hurricane came through and you're just going to retire off of people. It's but there is a balance there though. I think that there's an aspect of being like, well, they're looking at and this is somewhat market as well, where people are going to say, well, I can't find anybody else to do it. Yeah. And so therefore scarcity breeds additional cost. Yeah.
That's true. I think one thing that's important and I think a lot of the guys and gals who are listening to the podcast probably do this a lot because they're investing and growing.
Okay, let me interject there. Guys and gals, is guys these days apply to everybody?
I'm fine with guys, but I don't want to be offensive. I am also.
Oh, okay.
A lot of guys who are listening to this podcast.
Because I'm like, we love you all. Different teenagers, like they'll be like, hey guys, like girls will talk to each other as guys. I say, hey guys, I'm just curious. Like I wasn't trying to call you out.
Let us know in the comments below, guys.
I was just curious. I'm like, okay, does that apply to everybody, or do we have to call it ladies and gentlemen?
Yeah, welcome to the show. I don't know what you have to do. I don't know what's right anymore. Just kidding. I do. So I think it's important to assess where we're at. Right, take a minute and actually like reflect on where are you at, where are you bringing value, and how are you doing in these areas. Right, like how are you individually doing in character, in customer journey, in competition, reputation, abilities, availability, and timeliness. Really take an honest look at where you're at in those categories and rate yourself. That will help define the areas that you need to grow and your team needs to grow. So do that for yourself, for your company, and then do that for your people on your team. I think would be a really great, like just kind of pausing moment of if you have to pause the podcast and do it now and then come back to the rest of the podcast, do that. But spend a little bit of time
Scale of 1 to
reflecting
10, go through it. Yeah. And character, how are we doing?
Yeah, I think it's important.
The customer journey, what's that look like for us? How, where can we improve it?
Yeah.
How can we increase value there?
Or do we have it defined?
That's a good point.
Right? You probably, a lot of people probably don't even have it defined. They're like, I just do my best, which is okay. Like, that's good. You got to start somewhere. But it's like processes help you
checklists,
help you stay consistent. So
yeah,
it's good. Okay, so
taking a look at the competition too is an aspect of that as well.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just being like, what are other people doing? Sometimes you can learn from that. I think that's an aspect of hanging out. I heard somebody, and I'm trying to remember who this was, but it was somebody we connected with, and they basically, he connects with his competitors like a monthly breakfast with 3 or 4 other builders. And gets together. I mean, these are the guys winning the same jobs. It's friendly competition. They get together for breakfast. They shop talk. They collaborate. Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
What are you guys doing? How do you guys solve these problems? Now, I think was it Brad on the show was talking about like you don't abuse that of like when you're asking, like asking for the list of trades. But if you need help in one category, anyway, just I thought it was
resources
useful.
are available. Yeah,
to
that's good.
Hear from your competitors sometimes too.
That's good.
Yeah,
that's good. So how do you increase value? Like, let's go a little bit more practical. Of like, okay, how do I took the assessment. I know where I'm at. I'm a 2 on communication. I'm a 5. Whatever. That wherever you came out on that. How do you then increase, your value long term? How do you get to the point where you can charge more because you're adding value to support it?
There's an aspect of efficiency and in all of this, which is I think one of the biggest metrics of value is, let's take that hourly equation we're talking about before. So we have this, what can be done in that hour period of time, and that determines largely what's its worth. And so if you have 2 guys, one guy takes twice as long to do something, well, is he half the value of the other guy, essentially, and what somebody's willing to pay for it? So when you speak to hourly wage, well, he's twice as valuable.
Right.
And you guys have people you work with or people on your teams where you have that true, where one guy's way more efficient.
That's a good call out.
And so how can you be more efficient as a company? How do you tee your people up to be more efficient as well? If you're working with others, like, is that, making sure materials are on site, making sure all of that stuff's lined up in advance, where there's not any, delays, making sure you're, and another aspect of this too, Kinsey, is the efficiency aspect is making sure that you're there. If you are the leader of your team, if you're not there, you have somebody that's very competent there as well to make sure stuff doesn't get screwed up, because mistakes are so costly.
Right.
And that's a huge negative.
How do you motivate? We didn't talk about this before, but how do you motivate people to be more efficient? Because I think some people have like just an innate drive that they're like, I will do whatever it takes to accomplish the thing in the amount of time that's required. But some people don't have that extra gear. So how do you motivate that?
I got a couple of thoughts on this one. It's a great question. I think one thing is sometimes we call out the people on teams as you need to level up, you need to do this. And the more I've heard that, the more I start thinking to myself, and I was one of those people. First off, I was, how do I get my people to, be more efficient, do what they need to do? Why do I have to babysit them? Why do I have to handhold to get stuff done? And I'm kind of evolving into this line of thought of like, well, that's really not necessarily on the person I hired. Efficiency breeds more efficiency. If you watch really hyper efficient companies, they're successful because it's not just about dollars. It is very fun to get stuff done. Yeah. Checking stuff off a list is very gratifying.
Very rewarding.
And if you're in a company that just sucks and nobody cares, and it's just like, I don't care how long that takes, as opposed to everyone's hustling around you, like, and it's
you feel that.
You feel the energy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And too, I think people like to be liked. So if they're the one that's around that environment and they're like, don't have that gear, they're going to get a gear because they don't want to be the one that's pointed out of like, okay, they're the.
And if you have that on your team, maybe you need to cut that loose.
Yeah, true.
Either chain it out or you say, well, that's not a good fit. We all hustle here, and I think that's one aspect of it.
It's like a culture thing.
Yeah, it is a culture thing. I mean, and I think you need to say, well, if we all win, here's what I'm going to do about it. And we can do some profit sharing. There's lots of strategies around monetizing it, but it's not the primary thing.
Yeah.
It's funny. Dollars, I mean, you can work in a company where there's bonuses and there's all these other things and nobody wants to be there.
Yeah.
And then you can have another environment where people barely make a paycheck and they're like, I'm so locked in, I want to do this. So I think there's an aspect of winning is way more important than dollars in the bank, because everyone believes in, if we win, and I'm working for somebody of integrity, we all win.
Yeah.
And I think it's a big deal.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. What else increases value?
Experience, and I think we talked about that earlier, but just to call it out again, as you gain experience, it's interesting. Experience gives you something that if you make a distinction between skill and experience, like skill you can learn from just doing something over and over again, but experience is actually one of these things where when you do something many, many times, you see situations that you would have never otherwise seen. And so experience is it gives you wisdom. It gives you this level of, oh, I want to avoid that mistake, or the last time that happened. Yes, right. And so I think experience, if you're applying that experience and learning from it, that's creating value. And so I think that was one of our motivations in doing this podcast is because so many people feel like value is outside of you. You don't have agency in your value, but you have so much agency in what your value is. And just to remind everybody, I mean, like this is where it's at. This is really where it's at. Yeah. If you want to clean up, increase your value.
Yeah, no, that's good. What would you tell somebody who, just to dig into experience a little bit more, let's say they went into a trade or a business with some experience, not top level mastery experience in a skill or whatever. How would you suggest that they level up in the experience category? Because it's not super practical to be like, okay, I'm going to close this business and go work for somebody else. And you know what I mean? Like we're not suggesting that. So what would you say to somebody who owns their own business and they realize that they need to level up an experience and what are the steps to getting there?
Yeah. And I guess just to be kind of maybe unpack that a little bit more, there's sort of a natural progression of experience as well. Like, I remember when I first learned drywall taping, my dad, I think I was like 11 years old, and he took me to a job site and he's like, today we're taping drywall. And my dad had mastery of the skill. He was very, very good at it. Probably one of the best drywall tapers that I've known, where he could flatten a wall out. And so initially he said, well, your goal is not to get anything perfect. I mean, he did say this, but I mean, the unstated observation was my son is here to learn, watch, and he's, at the same time, we're not expecting a result from him. But over the course of time, I gained mastery of the skill by lots and lots of hours of patience and practice with it. Yeah. And when you're in the middle of it and learning a new skill, and sometimes it's very miserable. I mean, who wants to learn drywall taping? It's not a fun trade necessarily to learn. But once you get good at it, then you're like, wow, this is very gratifying. And I think that's an aspect of patience involved with gaining experience. Sometimes experience can be painful to gain. Yeah. I mean, so many of my experiences have been painful. Looking back at them, that sometimes they're entertaining.
The value you may have been to your dad at 11 with drywall taping may have been
probably
$1.
Yes, value definitely went up over time. Yes, when you start off with 0, it's pretty easy. As long as you don't screw something up.
Trajectory's good.
Yeah, I guess you could have negative value. Yeah. You could be just breaking.
You actually owe me money.
Yes, you're welcome, son. Yes, and I think at that age is kind of that's a great thing for our kids too. Like I have 4 boys. Like how can I give them that experience in an environment where it doesn't really matter? Like nobody's expecting an 11-year-old to do anything useful.
Sure. Yeah.
But when they do, it's like, oh, cool.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. What else? What else increases value?
I think the skill aspect of it is something that is somewhat different from experience because you kind of have to go after it a little bit. The experience sort of just happens somewhat. And I think this is kind of speaking to your question somewhat, is the skill pieces, the books you read, the people you hang out with, how do you improve your knowledge of something where you know more about it today than you did yesterday, that you've practiced it more than you did yesterday. And sometimes like experiences are like something's as a part of our course of life and running a business. It's like, oh, wow, that happened. Yeah. And now we're going to learn from it. Yeah. As opposed to like skill, something you go after. If you have teams, like training is huge. Yeah. Taking that knowledge and applying it and providing an environment for people like with Dan Parrish, what he's doing with the whole lab concept. That's awesome.
Such a cool concept. Yeah. It doesn't have to look like Dan Parrish's lab, guys.
We did hear some comments on that, like, whoa, that's legit. Yeah. Like, you don't have to invest in this,
$100,000 lab or whatever. I don't know what it is, but
at
still,
least,
probably.
I'm sure they put a lot of money into that.
But still, what he said on that podcast, though, was he wished he would have started sooner. Obviously not to that scale, right? But still having skills development and things like that. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's
the value you also are bringing, guys, is the consistency, being able to replicate things over and over again. Anybody can do something great one time, but can you do it over and over again? Can you show up to, with the same level of quality, the same professionalism, the efficiency, the experience, et cetera? And so
guys, efficiency, experience, skill, consistency.
It's good stuff.
So good.
Yeah.
So how does all that now practical, right?
Kenzie,
I know this question's hard, but it's what everybody wants to know.
Yes. Okay,
so how does that all translate to dollars, right? So if I'm a contractor, what should my hourly rate be? If I'm an electrician, if I'm a plumber, whatever the trade may be. Mm-hmm. And then when should that change? That's 3 questions in one. So have fun breaking that down. Yeah. But how does it translate to dollars?
Yeah.
So what should the hourly rate be? I guess that's the same question.
Yeah.
And then when should it change?
Yeah, you just
see how good you do on the spot.
Yeah, right. Well, let's go. The competition can be an aspect of this in a big way because you have some insight based on what other people are charging for a service. Now, sometimes that's hidden from us, right? You don't want to be sneaky about it in the sense of, trying to get bids from your competitors and wasting their time and trying to figure out what the going rate is. Right. But remember, we're talking about like connecting with competitors. Sometimes you can just be like, man, how do you price that specific thing out? The other thing about this is that this is even more crucial than checking out the competitors is knowing who your competitor really is. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is you might be new to something and your competitor is not the big name in town. So don't confuse yourself in the same league with that company because they have process, they have experience, they can repeat results and you're new.
Yeah.
And so your value proposition as a part of that is not going to be as high because you're learning.
That's good.
And the other thing is you can be competing against somebody that you're way past their skills and abilities and thinking that's your competition. So I got a case in point for you.
Yeah. Ready. Contractor
I know, he was looking at competition. He does window installs, and he was looking at his competition as being this guy with one, a guy, his helper in a truck doing window installs for $100 a piece. Okay. And he was thinking, well, there's no money in windows. Then he got just randomly happened to see a customer have a quote from another competitor in town that does windows installs. It was $58,000 to do, I think it was 13 or 15 windows or something. It was like 17. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, 58 grand. And he's like, whoa, there's huge money in windows. There's big money in windows.
New opportunity.
Yeah. New opportunity. So I think that speaks though of knowing who the competition really is, because he's not the guy competing with the $100 window install because he has the tools, the trucks, the brands, he has the reputation, like he has all of the skill, the experience, the repeatable results. And so you got to make sure you're looking at the right competition. But that said, competition can be informative of what your value is.
So good.
How do you get that? I think that's some of the conversations, you don't need to do this every day, but once a year you can kind of get a feel for what other people are charging for your services. How do they price themselves in the market?
Yeah, I think you could probably also, if you're like, I don't want to talk to the competitors in my town, you could probably find people that do the same thing on like Facebook groups or communities, things like that, and just try to understand a little bit more on how people are breaking things down like that. Now, obviously, there are specific market conditions in your specific area that are different from, they're different here in Springfield, Mo, than they are in California, things like that. That's, everybody knows that costs are going to be different, things like that. But to at least understand how people are thinking about that, I think could be a valuable resource as well.
Yeah, and I think you do want to understand the business aspect of it and pricing yourself as well. That is an important part of the equation. Today, we're talking about value, not just business. And I think there's the simple equation like we were talking about earlier of being like, I pay my guy $26 an hour. By the time I add my taxes, my workman's comp, all of the labor burden to pay for his time off, his vacation time, et cetera, and some inefficiency as a result of like travel time and shop and meetings and all the rest of it. Well, he costs me $37 an hour. Well, that's a fixed number. Then you add your overhead on top of it. And so you have a business equation, right? You could say, well, I need to charge $63 an hour in order to make money for that guy, to pay for my overhead, to pay for the cost of having an employee. Well, that's a number. I mean, you need to know that.
Yeah.
And I think that can be helpful. But then we go back to what we were talking about earlier, and that's the inefficiency. If that guy is not able to produce, well, I mean, you could be charging $150 an hour for him and losing money because the value proposition doesn't match what you're charging. So I think that's the thing we're talking about is it's very deceptive to look at, well, what's a fair hourly wage instead of trying to break that down of saying, well, what is the value proposition here? And I think that's and how do we increase the value proposition? Okay. So if times are tough, if there's more competition, how do you stand out? So this is where it's at, guys. The value proposition you bring is like focusing on value instead of like trying to squeeze the golden goose and get more out of it.
So good. So good. Well, that felt like a key takeaway, but do you have another key takeaway?
I think as a final thought here, it's just back to the whole thing that like value is changing over time.
Yeah.
Is keep this in mind as you grow from here, guys. Is just as you as Kinsey was talking about, like the assessment of just making sure that you're looking at your business and saying, and you personally, if like,
personally,
yeah, I'm better today than I was yesterday, and that's worth something. And don't let other people inform you of what your value is in the sense of you're worth $35 an hour. That's not necessarily true. And I think there's an aspect of doing the right thing, of ethics involved, of like, I don't want to take advantage of people, and that's respectable.
Yes.
And there's an aspect of being like, but you're also worth more because you applied yourself, because you put the blood, sweat, and tears into it. And the fair thing to do is to pay, for people to pay you for that.
Right.
And so
good.
Keep that in mind. And
so good.
Yeah.
Guys, you're doing awesome.
Yeah. It's a tough industry to be in. Yeah. And there's so many times it can feel kind of lonely too, right? Yeah. I mean, you feel like, man, how do I figure that out? And it's not necessarily the most collaborative industry either.
Yeah, true.
Where
it's very
you feel like you're on an island.
Yeah.
Yeah, like our secret formula. What we do is,
Yeah, we've heard that before. Oh, guys, you're doing great. Let us know what helped you in this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Looking forward to it.